Aerodynamic design dictates operational survival. For a heavy, twin-engine medium bomber, wing area helps determine wing loading, and therefore the airspeed margin available before a stall. The stall itself begins when the wing exceeds its critical angle of attack. Weight, configuration, and load factor determine the indicated speed at which that boundary is reached. In the early Marauder, Martin pursued high performance with a compact, low aspect ratio wing. That geometry did not eliminate drag. It balanced aerodynamic performance, structural demands, and speed, while imposing a severe low-speed penalty. This design choice created a rigid constraint during an emergency. High wing loading meant the aircraft had to maintain more indicated airspeed than many contemporary bombers, especially near the ground. If the pilot allowed the angle of attack to rise past the critical limit, the wing stalled, and altitude could disappear rapidly. Published figures place the early model's landing speed at roughly 120 to 135 miles per hour indicated, depending on load. Even at the lower end of that range, an off-runway landing forced the structure to absorb enormous kinetic energy. The United States Army Air Forces faced this exact aerodynamic boundary with the early production Martin B-26 Marauder. The specific machine caught in this operational trap was serial number 401459. It was the 99th B-26 produced by the Martin Company. Aviation historians classify this airframe as a straight B-26, meaning that its military designation carried no letter suffix. It retained the original 65-foot wing and the unusually high wing loading of the first production standard. The longer 71-foot wing entered production with the B-26 B-10 and contemporary B-26 C blocks, improving low-speed handling on later aircraft. During a winter ferry movement toward Alaska, 14 new Marauders left Gowan Field in Idaho. By January 16th, the Edmonton to Whitehorse leg had placed the crews over a long, sparsely supported route in deteriorating weather. Accounts describe pencil sketches in place of adequate maps and an absence of ground-based electronic navigation aids. The crews depended on headings, elapsed time, visual position fixes, and whatever breaks the weather allowed. By evening, 3 of the bombers had become lost, low on fuel, and separated from the security of the larger movement. The short-span, early model Marauder left little forgiveness near the stall, but it did not prevent a controlled descent or force the pilots to maintain cruising speed inside the weather. Reducing power alone does not cause a stall. The critical boundary is reached when the wing exceeds its allowable angle of attack. The crew's real trap was navigational and temporal. Poor weather, uncertain position, and continued flight consumed the remaining fuel, forcing them beneath snow showers to search for a landing site. Fuel gauges dropped toward zero, forcing an immediate decision. With no secure position fix and fuel nearly exhausted, the crews elected to make forced landings if they could find suitable ground. The available accounts do not preserve a formal comparison with bailout or prove that the 3 aircraft descended as a single coordinated formation. What they do establish is that the crews searched at low altitude until they found a broad valley with a comparatively level floor. Finding a clearing was only the first step. The straight model B-26 remained demanding at low speed, but its pilots were not compelled to fly it into the ground at exactly 150 miles per hour. The decisive question was how the landing configuration and deep snow would shape the deceleration once the bombers touched the valley floor. Surface geometry strongly influences the survivability of a high-speed off-field landing. Deep snow can conceal hard obstacles and impose unpredictable drag, while extended landing gear can dig into a soft surface and pitch an aircraft forward. On January 16, 1942, the 3 crews entered a remote British Columbia valley near the Smith River, with almost no fuel remaining. Aircraft 4014-59 and 4015-01 landed wheels up, while aircraft 4014-64 came down with its landing gear extended and nosed over. Contemporary summaries place the snow depth at approximately 4 to 5 feet and describe the two wheels-up landings as occurring without that nose-over. The snow probably reduced the severity of contact, but the record does not quantify touchdown speed, slide distance, deceleration loads, or forces carried by the wing spars. These were forced landings on land, not ditchings. The forced landings ended the flight emergency, but they began a separate rescue operation. A search started on January 17th. The missing crews were located the following day, and evacuation began on January 19th, continuing until all of the men had been removed from the valley. Aircraft 4014-59 was formally listed as condemned on February 17th. Only in April did Army Air Force's salvage crews return. Museum records identify the engines, landing gear, radio equipment, and weapons among the items removed for wartime use. Beyond that core inventory, the precise fate of every instrument, panel, fairing, and hydraulic component is not established in the accessible record. Full recovery was impractical, and the remaining aluminum structures were abandoned in place. The three bombers soon gave the site its enduring nickname, $1 Million Valley, a local expression whose valuation belonged more to legend than to precise wartime accounting. The 1942 stripping changed the long-term exposure of the wreckage. Open compartments and missing equipment left the structure more vulnerable to snow, rain, debris, standing moisture, and corrosion. Water entering cavities could freeze and expand, while repeated wetting and high humidity could accelerate deterioration of metal surfaces and joints. Yet no surviving inspection report identifies the exact locations in which water pooled, or proves that particular rivets, bulkheads, or wing roots were forced apart. The defensible conclusion is narrower, but still severe. The abandoned airframe endured almost 3 decades of uncontrolled outdoor exposure before recovery began. 29 years of wilderness exposure created a severe test of whatever structure the salvage crews had left behind. From 1942 until the recovery effort of 1971, the wreckage remained in place near Smith River. Its survival is evident from the fact that substantial sections were ultimately recovered. But the available histories do not quantify alloy loss, bulkhead strength, snow loading, or the depth of corrosion before work began. Nor do they document a regular program of verification by overflight. For most of that period, the bombers simply remained beyond practical reach in the northern wilderness. This static condition changed in the fall of 1971. Aviation collector David Tallichet organized a Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation expedition to recover the 3 Smith River wrecks. Their identities were anchored by military records and the documented serials associated with the accident: 4014-59, 4014-64, and 4015-01. The surviving short wings and early production geometry could confirm that the wreckage belonged to the original B-26 standard. But geometry alone could not distinguish one serial number from another. For aircraft 4014-59, the decisive proof was the documentary chain linking the wreck to the 99th Marauder built. Confirming the identities solved the historical question, but the physical problem remained. Could the surviving sections be separated and removed before winter closed the valley? Tallichet's team worked through the fall of 1971 and, over approximately 3 months, recovered virtually everything that remained. The available accounts do not describe a formal structural audit, corrosion measurements, tests of the wing roots, or an engineering finding that the bomber retained certified load-bearing strength. The recovery itself shows that substantial sections remained strong enough to be handled, but their precise condition at the start of the expedition is unconfirmed. The expedition now possessed rare but incomplete wreckage in the middle of a remote mountain basin. Weight still governed every movement, but the aircraft's published loaded weight could not be used as the weight of the recovered structure. The engines, landing gear, radio equipment, weapons, fuel, and much of the internal equipment had already been removed. No recovered component manifest or verified sling-load calculation has been located. What the record establishes is that Tallichet's team reduced the wreckage into transportable sections and prepared it for shipment out of the wilderness. The recovery team had to reduce the remaining structures into sections that could be moved out of the valley. Available histories state that the Marauders were disassembled for shipment. They do not document a formal debate between destructive cutting and preservation, a strict prohibition on cutting, or a requirement to separate every component along untouched factory seams. The most accurate account is therefore the simplest. Tallichet's crew broke the wreckage down into transportable assemblies while attempting to retain material useful for later restoration. The next stage disappears into a gap in the surviving public record. Tallichet's team unquestionably dismantled the Smith River wrecks between September and November of 1971. But the accessible accounts do not reveal the exact fasteners opened, tools used, supports constructed, or lifting assemblies fitted. There is no verified description of localized heat, penetrating solvents, spar bolt extraction, timber shoring, nylon straps, spreader bars, or loadmaster calculations. Those details must remain unconfirmed unless expedition photographs, work logs, or testimony can establish them. The historical record must trace how these isolated, heavy components completed their physical journey out of the mountain basin to a secure holding facility. Moving the dismantled aircraft from the valley floor to road transport was the crucial logistical link, but the surviving summaries do not describe that route in detail. The site is commonly placed approximately 22 air miles north-northeast of the Smith River Bridge, yet that reference point does not prove an exact 15-mile movement to a logging road. No recovery map or expedition log reviewed here establishes the staging point, the distance traveled by each component, or a fuel-driven short-hop strategy. The detailed helicopter sequence is unconfirmed. The accessible recovery histories state that Tallichet's team disassembled the aircraft and that the recovered sections were eventually trucked to Chino, California. They do not identify a heavy lift helicopter, its operator, the number of sorties, cargo hook procedures, flight path, sling configuration, or a timber cribbing system. Until primary expedition evidence establishes that intermediate stage, the precise movement from the valley floor to the trucks must remain unresolved. By the end of the 1971 recovery, the dismantled sections had been removed from the Smith River site and transported by truck to Chino, California. There, the Military Aircraft Restoration Corporation placed the components in storage. The surviving histories do not document the mobile cranes, custom wooden cradles, chain routes, bridge calculations, way station procedures, or border convoy described in later retellings. What can be stated securely is that the wreckage reached Chino in dismantled form and remained there for years while decisions about restoration and distribution developed. The physical recovery was complete. The much longer reconstruction story had barely begun. An engineering contradiction defined the project that reached the Maps Air Museum in 1994. The museum did not receive one complete, continuously preserved airframe. It received parts from two of the Smith River aircraft, primarily components associated with serial number 401459. The tail section arrived on August 6th. The nose and center sections followed on August 27th. What entered the restoration shop was therefore a composite collection of rare early Marauder structure, incomplete after wartime stripping, decades outdoors, recovery, storage, and the exchange of components among separate restoration projects. The restoration objective evolved over time rather than beginning with a single permanent decision. Records from the 1990s describe plans or aspirations to return the aircraft to flight. and a map's publication in 2007 still reported efforts toward flying condition. The completed project ultimately became a long-term static restoration. That change in ambition mattered. It allowed the museum to complete the bomber as an exhibit without claiming that its composite, repaired structure met the certification and fatigue requirements of an airworthy aircraft. Once static display became the practical outcome, the restoration no longer had to satisfy the full aerodynamic, fatigue, vibration, and certification demands of flight. That did not make the replacement structure mechanically irrelevant. New panels, control surfaces, windows, fairings, and fittings still had to carry their own weight, transfer attachment loads, survive handling, and remain stable during long-term exhibition. The surviving records also do not establish that the Marauder is kept permanently in a climate-controlled environment. It is more accurate to describe the work as non-airworthy reconstruction, engineered for safe static display. Before the aircraft could be completed, volunteers cleaned, repaired, and stabilized the surviving structure. Maps records document work on the fuselage exterior, wings, horizontal stabilizer, gear doors, bomb bay doors, floors, access panels, and cockpit components. They do not identify a deep penetrating chemical inhibitor treatment of the wing roots or lower fuselage ribs. Nor can any conservation treatment guarantee that corrosion has stopped permanently. The accurate conclusion is that the original material was repaired and stabilized for continuing museum inspection and care. With the surviving structure repaired, volunteers spent years replacing missing surfaces and completing the external form of the early Marauder. Maps records document repaired wings, new ribs and tips, replacement panels, control surfaces, windows, cowling sections, engines, and propellers. The original bomber had been powered by Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines, but the published restoration record does not establish the exact subtype or provenance of the engines now installed for display. It also does not document the claimed reinforcement calculations for their mounts. The defensible account is that display engines and propellers were fitted as part of the aircraft's visual completion. The final assembly combined surviving Smith River structure with repaired, replacement, and newly fabricated components. Volunteers completed the wings, control surfaces, glazing, nacelles, exterior panels, engines, and propellers until the incomplete wreckage once again carried the silhouette of an early Martin bomber. The finished static exhibit wears an olive drab presentation and the commemorative name Susie Q in honor of pilot Jim Murray. Those are display markings, not the documented operational identity of serial number 401459.